Daddy, tell me what's going on.
There's blood all over the house. My brother-in-law's in the bedroom, and I beat the hell out of him.
It's all this stuff. It's on the news. I just found my cousin with a gunshot wound.
Okay, sir, is she alive?
No.
Deep in the Appalachian foothills of Pike County, Ohio, 8 members of the Rhoden family were slain, execution-style, in their beds on the night of April 21st into the morning of April 22nd, 2016. 3 children, all aged 3 and under, were spared, and a tight-knit Appalachian community was left with questions of who had done such an act and why. The largest mass murder in Ohio history would also set off one of its largest criminal investigations.
I just might tell you this is just the most bizarre story I've ever seen.
A phoenix called 911 on the morning of April 22nd, leading authorities to the evil that had been done as the sister of one of the victims arrived at the property to feed the animals on the farm. She, Bobby Jo Manley, and her brother James then went into the house, discovering the horrors that had been done. Law enforcement officers and first responders flocked quickly to the scene and went into the cluster of 3 homes. The grisly discoveries they made showed that the attackers had achieved complete and total surprise on their victims. In the living room of the first house, they found the 40-year-old patriarch of the Rhoden clan, Christopher Rhoden Sr., who had been shot 9 times from very close range, and was the only one of the entire family to show even the slightest signs of defensive wounds. 5 of the shots were to the face and head. Another 3 were in his torso, and a single gunshot was in his arm, as if he had attempted to ward off the attack. Nearby lay the body of Gary Rhoden, age 38, Christopher's cousin. The man had 2 gunshot wounds to the head from close range, and a third close enough to leave a muzzle stamp on his temple. There was no sign of struggle from Gary, and it is thought he was asleep at the time the first shot was fired. In the next house, Chris's eldest son, Clarence Frankie Rhoden, and his fiancée, Hina Hazel Gilly, were found murdered in their bed. Their unborn child was found unharmed lying between them. While their 3-year-old child was found asleep on the floor, Frankie had been shot 3 times in the head and face, and Hina Gilly had been shot through the eye, and an additional 4 times. James Manley then rushed down to the 3rd home, that of his sister and Chris Rhoden Sr.'s ex-wife, Donna Rhoden, a home they shared with their 16-year-old son, Chris Jr., and daughter Hina. Hina, 19, had just given birth 4 days before to her 2nd child. Dana had been shot 5 times in the head, including point-blank shots through the temple and 1 upward under the chin. In a nearby room, Chris Jr. was found with 2 fatal gunshots through the top of his head. In the last room, Hina Rhoden was found dead from 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The newborn baby was unharmed and still attempting to suckle at the mother's breast. Her 2-year-old daughter Sophia was staying with his father and the family while Hina recovered from the birth, so she had been spared this night of horrors. As police and first responders swarmed over the scene, the area was cordoned off, and the members of the local community began to gather to offer support and share in the shock of the discoveries. As news spread about the killings, a man from the crowd, Donald Stone, a cousin of Chris Rhoden Sr., began to worry about another member of the Rhoden clan who lived a few miles further down the road. He quickly called Kenneth Rhoden, age 44, and no one answered. Stone and 2 friends quickly drove down to Kenneth's small home and found that that man had not been spared the grisly fate of the other members of the family. He lay dead in the house with a single gunshot wound through his eye, fired from close range.
When you walked up to the residence, did you notice, was the door unlocked?
Yes.
Okay. So you walked into the residence together, and you said Luke was there first, but then you, and then what happened?
And then we walked in. We walked into supposedly the living room, and I noticed to the right, I didn't see him in there nowhere, so I seen a stairway to the right. And I walked up the stairway, and that's where I found him up there in his bed.
And when you say you found him, who did you find?
I found Kenny. He was dead.
There were now 8 dead, all members of the same extended family, and there was a disturbing lack of evidence as to who had committed the massacre. No shell casings were found. There were no reports of any gunshots. 2 pit bulls that lived at one of the trailers didn't even start barking that night, and that particular pair of dogs had a reputation for being hostile to anyone they did not know. In addition, not a single cell phone was found among the victims. There were no other signs of theft, so the missing phones had to in some way be a removal of possible evidence by the perpetrators. The sheer number of deaths without any signs of the victims being alerted pointed to multiple sources rather than a single suspect. But who could have done it? Forensic experts from the County Sheriff's Department and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation scoured the scene for any evidence they could find. Police sought out witnesses and tips, racing to outpace rumors and the code of the hills that might keep some people silent. Families in the community attempted to cope with the loss of so many lives as they buried their loved ones in the deep, dark hills of Appalachian, Ohio. The Rhoden patriarch, Chris Sr., and his brother Kenneth had a reputation for being on the wrong side of the law. The discovery of a pot-growing operation in the barn next to Kenneth's house and the discovery of what could have been a cockfighting ring set up at the family complex only strengthened the suspicions that those endeavors had brought an end to those men. Rumors swirled about the community that the Rhodens had been involved with a Mexican drug cartel and that had led to their demise. Hundreds of tips poured into law enforcement, and rewards were posted looking for evidence in the slayings. State and local investigators poured through the tips and tracked down potential connections, but to no avail. The vehicles, mobile homes, and other evidence were removed from the Rhodens' property and put into storage to preserve them as their work continued. Custody of the 3 children left alive at the orphanage and 2-year-old Sophia was brought to the courts to be decided. Little Sophia, safely at the home of her father and another set of grandparents on the night of the murders, it turns out, would be the linchpin for the entire investigation and the centerpiece for the entire massacre. Investigators had no way of knowing at the time that what looked like an organized crime hit was actually a vendetta between 2 families that played out over the custody of that small child. Billy Wagner and Chris Rhoden Sr. had history together. There was no doubt about that. They didn't live that far apart, and both were from a more rough-and-tumble part of the community. The possibility that they had sometimes been partners in crime and possibly competitors in it was common knowledge of that part of local lore. Billy's son Jake and Chris's daughter Hannah Rhoden had dated from the time she was 13 until a year or so before the killing, and they shared a daughter, Sophia. Outwardly, Billy Wagner shared nothing but praise and friendship with Chris, particularly in an interview with the Ohio BCI.
Me and him, our plan was going to buy a car on the beach and just sit there and, get drunk, sit on the beach and, play with the strippers.
Once again, outwardly, the entire Wagner family seemed to be very concerned with Sophia's well-being. They filed for custody of the child shortly after the murders, producing documents allegedly signed by Hannah Rhoden, stating that the father would have sole custody of the child should anything happen to her. And as the community settled back into normal life over the next few months, the Wagners as a group pulled up stakes and left the community. They headed to Alaska. About as far away as you could get from the violence that had occurred in Ohio, they would return as a group, along with a new wife for Jake, about a year later. Things had cooled down in Pike County, and while the investigation wore on, life there had returned to normal for the regular population. The Wagners reintegrated into the community, and all the men got jobs at a local trucking company, where they were, for all intents and purposes, model employees, and that, in retrospect, was a little outside of their normal pattern. One of an illicit underage love affair, jealousy and conspiracy, a story that would lead to cold-blooded, calculated murders, all to obtain permanent custody of the young Sophia. Assistant Attorney General Angela Canapa, leading the prosecution in the case, laid out the beginnings of the love affair to the court, setting the stage for what was to come.
It kind of starts with a love story, if you want to call that. A very young teenage girl, Hannah Mae Rhoden, age 13 at the time, was at the Pike County Fairgrounds. She participated in 4-H, and she had bunnies, and somebody introduced her to Jacob, who was almost 18 at that time, and she kept asking him to look at her bunnies or pet her bunnies. Jake will tell you that he was annoyed initially, but then on a second chance meeting, they started dating, if you can date at age 13. That was in August of 2010. Reportedly, Jake gets permission from Chris Rhoden Sr. to date his daughter, his very young daughter. Chris Rhoden agrees, but he always sends along a chaperone. Either Frankie or little Chris go with Hannah Mae whenever she's hanging out with Jake Rhoden. And you will learn as well that Chris Rhoden Sr. also knew Billy Wagner. They were in fact friends. And so because of that, he gave his permission for her to be dating Jake.
The two broke up after jealousy and anger took a turn for the worse within Jake. She called her father to come and get her after Jake allegedly choked her. She said that she couldn't take how the whole family attempted to control her life, not just Jake. From there, the battle began over who should have full-time custody of the child. Hannah proclaimed on social media to her friends that she would never give the baby up to Jake, and that she'd rather die than give a child up to him and his family. What she did not know was that the messages were being monitored because Jake and his mother, Angela Wagner, had hacked into her Facebook account. A seemingly private statement to her friends may well have set the families on a direct path that would lead to her death and those of 7 of her loved ones. Jake had already made statements saying that he didn't like the people Hannah was seeing or who their child was being exposed to. It was during this time that Hannah began dating a man named Charlie Gilley, the brother of her sister-in-law, Hannah Gilley. The short-lived relationship would result in another pregnancy for young Hannah Rhoden. The birth of that child didn't just further push Jake over the edge. It also provided the Wagner family with an opportunity to enact a plan they had been working on for some time. 4 months prior to the birth of the child, Jake and his family had gathered around a table in their home to entertain a plan devised by Billy Wagner to remove Hannah, not just from the picture alone, but to remove anyone else who might have a claim to Jake and Hannah's child, Sophia. The possibility that other scores between the two families were going to get settled as well cannot be ruled out. The Wagners voted on it, as they often did with many life decisions that would affect the group. There were killings to be done, and afterwards they would file legal motions for the custody of Jake's daughter. No one would be left to stand in their way, and there would be no challenges to follow. What happened next was months of planning, purchasing, and preparing to do the deeds. The Wagners knew they had to cover their tracks and be discreet in every phase of the plan if they were to get away with their skullduggery as they intended. They needed to be thorough in the killings. They needed to be quiet in the planning. They needed to leave no evidence behind, and they needed to make sure no one would be alerted to the killings as they were happening. Investigators also found through the receipts and video evidence that the Wagners made purchases of shoes during the same month of the homicide that was matched by Demi Clay. The shoe-type marks were left in blood at one of the scenes. The family began by purchasing 2 pairs of athletic shoes from a nearby Walmart, one for each of the sons. The shoes were not the size worn by the children. The shoes were not used, but instead were intended to be worn on the night of the murder. The shoes were different sizes than the young man normally wears, and they were styles they would not normally have chosen. Handguns were obtained for each of the 2 sons. The firearms chosen were .22 caliber long rifles and semi-automatic pistols, which are quieter and have less recoil than larger caliber pistols, but still very deadly, particularly at the short ranges used in the murders. The men also purchased a suppressor for one in parts for making a second for the other gun. The two sons practiced with those weapons and others extensively over the intervening months in a wooded area behind the Wagner family property, as shown by later investigations where bullets were recovered from standing trees. The family also purchased a cell phone jamming device to be used during the slayings, and both young men dyed their hair to further change their appearances. The Wagners drove up to the Rhoden family property, which included 3 trailers and homes along with a number of outbuildings and other farm features. The father, Billy Wagner, went into the house of Chris Rhoden Sr., ostensibly to recruit him for a lucrative drug deal. George and Jake hid in the pickup truck as their father gained entrance to the home. With murderous efficiency, they moved from home to home, killing adults and youths, but leaving the infants and toddlers untouched, just as they had planned. And then they disappeared into the night and began their plans to dispose of any evidence and assumed their roles as shocked, surprised, and concerned members of the community, ones who shared a bond of friendship and were near family with the murdered Rhodens. The truck was dumped outside of the area. Their clothes and shoes were disposed of. The weapons, which could certainly incriminate them if ever found, were made to disappear in an ingenious manner. A cousin of the Wagners was having a birthday in the very near future. The man was a fisherman and often took his boat out on nearby lakes and waterways to enjoy his activity. The Wagners took the guns, shell casings, and suppressor remnants and placed them in gallon buckets, hanging them by long lengths of rope. They then poured wet cement into the buckets and let them dry, sealing the evidence of their deadly deeds, and they turned them into boat anchors as gifts to the cousin. Those anchors were later taken out to a local lake, and their lines were cut, sending the evidence to the muddy bottom. They would have remained there, unknown and lost, had things not taken the turn that they did. The 4 publicly maintained the image throughout their move to Alaska and again back to Ohio. But cracks began to appear in the facade. Perhaps the 2 women who left the family gave information, or perhaps someone at work overheard a conversation. But whatever it was, local and state law enforcement began putting together the pieces. Soon, listening devices were hidden in the work trucks used by the Wagners, and a wiretap was begun as well. The Wagners were questioned as to their relationships with the Rhodens, then brought in, and finally charged with the murders and other crimes dealing with that night. Sitting in jail, proclaiming their innocence, the specter of COVID-19 dropped onto the world, and the family found themselves incarcerated, separated, and awaiting trial for nearly 2 years. 2 years that proved to be too much for Jake. Jake Wagner cracked under the weight of the silence and admitted to all 23 charges that had been levied against him. He cut a plea deal with the state in exchange for the death penalty not being used against him or his family. He would tell me everything. He said that he personally pulled the trigger on 5 of the killings, leaving the other 3 deaths to weigh on the shoulders of his father and brother. He also testified that his mother did not have a hand in the actual killings, but had stayed home that night. He did, however, implicate her in the conspiracy, the cover-up, and the forgery of the custody documents. With his plea deal, Jake will serve 8 concurrent life sentences for his crimes, with no chance at parole. Angela will serve a 30-year sentence for her role. Both Billy and George are undergoing trials for these crimes at the time of the story. Both have refused to admit their guilt. Text messages obtained from the night of the killings corroborated, in part, his story of the pretext for the meeting of Billy Wagner and Chris Rhoden Sr. The weapons, hidden in the cement anchors, were recovered and broken from their molds. Bullets matching those recovered from the bodies were found in random trees on the back portion of the Wagners' property, along with the remnants of the burned-out homemade suppressor, like those found with the recovered weapons. It was a long, slow grind, but the wheels of law, if not justice, seemed to have finally caught up with those who murdered members of the Rhoden family 6 years ago. Jealousy and rage, conspiracy and lies, all have now given way to the survivors, who must carry on, however they can. Our thoughts and hopes go with them. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like the video, comment down below with your take, and subscribe to the channel. Also, don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date each time we reveal a new shocking case.